Every single year, roughly 4 million people make their way to the edge of New York Harbor, tilt their heads back, and look up at her. A woman made of copper, standing in the same spot she has occupied for more than 130 years. They take the photograph. They feel whatever it is they feel. Maybe awe, maybe pride, maybe just that quiet and specific sensation of standing in front of something that has outlasted almost everything else in the world they grew up in. And then they leave. And she stays. Exactly where she has always been, torch raised above the water, facing the Atlantic. But here is what I need you to hold on to before we go any further, because this changes everything about what you're about to see. She almost didn't make it. And I don't mean almost in the way that people say it about great things in retrospect, where it sounds dramatic but was never really in serious doubt. I mean almost in the way that for actual years, the money ran out completely. The plans fell apart. The engineer who was supposed to design her internal structure died before finishing his blueprints, and the fully completed statue sat in wooden crates on a New York dock with literally nowhere to go. Because the pedestal she was supposed to stand on didn't exist yet. I mean almost in the way that the most recognized symbol of American freedom in human history came within a handful of bad decisions of becoming a permanent resident of Paris, France. Stay with me, because the real story of how the Statue of Liberty was built is not the version you got in 4th grade. It is stranger, more desperate, more human, and ultimately more moving than anything the official account gives you credit for. And I promise you, by the time we get to the end of this, you're going to look at that harbor photograph completely differently than you do right now. Let's go back to where this actually starts. Not 1886, not the dedication ceremony, not Bedloe's Island or the copper sheets or the famous torch. Let's go back to a dinner party. Versailles, France, summer of 1865. The American Civil War has just ended. France is living under the rule of Napoleon III, which is a complicated arrangement that a lot of French intellectuals find deeply uncomfortable. And a legal scholar named Édouard de La Boulaye, one of the most serious students of American democracy anywhere in Europe, a man who has written a 3-volume history of the United States and followed the Civil War with the intensity of someone who believes the outcome matters for the whole world, is hosting guests at his home outside Paris. At some point during that dinner, La Boulaye says something. He says it the way ideas sometimes arrive at dinner tables, fully formed, almost surprised to find themselves being spoken out loud. He says that France ought to build a monument to American independence, a gift, a shared symbol between two nations that had each, in their own way, committed themselves to the idea that people ought to govern themselves. Something permanent, something large enough to be seen from the harbor. Sitting at that table is a sculptor named Frédéric Auguste Bartholdi. He is 21 years old. He is already drawn to monumental scale, in a way that most 21-year-olds are not. He has been thinking about a proposal for a lighthouse at the entrance to the Suez Canal, a colossal figure holding a torch over the water. He is, in retrospect, exactly the right person to be in that room at exactly that moment. He does not forget what La Boulaye says. He carries it for years. By 1870, the political situation in France has collapsed. War with Prussia, the fall of Napoleon III, the chaos of the Paris Commune. La Boulaye's project sits on hold, because you cannot propose a monument to liberty when your own country is actively falling apart. But by 1871, things have stabilized enough that Bartholdi books a passage to America. He wants to see the country the statue is meant to honor. He wants to understand, physically and emotionally, what it feels like to arrive in New York Harbor by ship. He wants to find the place. The moment he sails into the harbor and sees Bedloe's Island, a small, star-shaped piece of land already occupied by an old military fortification called Fort Wood, he knows. That is where she goes. He can see her there as clearly as if she were already standing. He is 27 years old, and he has just decided what he is going to do with the next 15 years of his life. He spends months traveling the country, meeting politicians, writers, businessmen, and ordinary Americans. he meets President Ulysses Grant. He writes back to La Boulée that the enthusiasm is genuine, that the Americans are interested, that the project is possible. What he does not say, what he perhaps does not fully acknowledge to himself, is that the money question is already impossibly complicated. France will build the statue. America will build the pedestal. 2 nations, 1 monument, shared responsibility. In theory. In practice, 2 separate fundraising campaigns, 2 separate committees, 2 sets of donors being asked to pay significant money for something that won't exist for at least a decade, in a harbor most of them have never sailed into. It was, from the very beginning, a logistical framework that required an extraordinary number of things to go right simultaneously. Almost none of them did, on schedule, or on budget, or without crisis. But we'll get there. First, Bartholdi has to build a statue that has never been built before. The process he uses is one that had genuinely never been attempted at this scale, and understanding it changes how you look at the finished work. He starts with a small clay model, a few feet tall, and refines it over months until every proportion, every fold of robe, every line of the face is exactly what he wants. Then he scales it up, then up again, then up a 3rd time. Each version is 4 times the size of the previous one, built in sections, checked against the smaller model, adjusted, rebuilt. By the time he is working at full scale, individual pieces of the statue are being constructed in a workshop on the Rue de Chazelle in Paris, in a neighborhood that must have felt briefly and inexplicably surreal to anyone passing by on a regular Tuesday afternoon. Because here is what the neighbors would have seen looking over the fence of that workshop. Enormous copper body parts. A hand the size of a carriage. A nose longer than a man is tall. Sections of draped copper robe stacked against the workshop wall like lumber, waiting for a construction site. The face of liberty, 30 feet high, sitting in a courtyard while workers swarmed over it with hammers, shaping the metal from the inside out. The technique is called repoussé. Copper sheets are hammered over wooden forms from behind, pushing the metal into shape without any welding or casting. Every curve of her robe, every fold of her raised arm, every feature of her face was created this way, by hand, by craftsmen who understood that they were building something the world had never seen and might not see again. The workshops employed hundreds of workers. The sound of constant hammering must have been something you could hear from blocks away. The first completed piece was the right arm, the arm with the torch. By 1876, it was finished, and Bartholdi made a decision that was equal parts marketing genius and genuine pride. He shipped it to the United States for display at the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition, the World's Fair celebrating the 100th anniversary of American independence. Now picture this. You are at the 1876 World's Fair in Philadelphia. You are an American who has read about this French project in the newspapers, found it vaguely interesting, maybe a little abstract, and then you turn a corner at the fairground, and there is a 27-foot copper arm rising out of the ground in front of you, with a balcony built into the torch, so that for 50 cents you can climb up inside it and stand where Liberty's hand will eventually be, and look out over the fairground. Thousands of people did it. It stopped being abstract very quickly. The arm worked as a fundraising tool in a way that speeches and newspaper articles never could, because it gave people the physical experience of scale. You could stand inside a piece of this thing. You could feel how large it was going to be. The idea of a colossal statue in New York Harbor became, for a few minutes at a time, something your body could understand rather than just your mind. After Philadelphia, the arm was moved to Madison Square Park in New York City, where it sat for several years, a giant copper appendage in the middle of Manhattan, pointing upward at nothing, waiting for the rest of itself to arrive. People walked past it every day. Children climbed on the fencing around it. It became a kind of landmark in its own right, a physical argument that this project was real and coming, whether the city got organized or not. Back in Paris, Bartholdi finished the head. By 1878, Liberty's face and upper torso were complete, and he arranged for the head to be displayed at the Paris World's Fair, the Exposition Universelle on the Champ de Mars. The 30-foot copper face, with its crown of 7 rays, drew enormous crowds. Bartholdi sold tickets to tour the workshop. He raffled off miniature replicas of the statue. He gave interviews to every journalist who would sit still long enough. He understood something that most artists of his era didn't, that the project would die without sustained public attention. And sustained public attention required constant, deliberate cultivation. By the end of 1878, he could say with genuine satisfaction that the statue was half built. What he could not say, though everyone involved knew it, was that the American half of the project was quietly becoming a crisis. The pedestal fund was stalled. The committee responsible for raising money on the American side had collected a fraction of what was needed. Wealthy donors were politely uninterested. There was a persistent strain of American opinion that found the whole thing mildly presumptuous. France was giving America a statue nobody had asked for, and now Americans were being told to pay for the base. The newspapers were not uniformly enthusiastic. The general public was not yet engaged in the way that Bartholdi needed them to be. And then, in 1879, the project suffered a blow that could genuinely have ended it. Eugène Viollet-le-Duc, the celebrated French architect who had been working on the internal structure that would hold the copper skin upright, died. He died before completing his plans. The statue had a skin and no skeleton, and the man who was supposed to design the skeleton was gone. Here is the moment where a lesser project stops, where committees convene and issue statements about regrettable setbacks and quietly let the whole thing dissolve. Here is the moment where the gap between vision and execution becomes too large to cross. Bartholdi found Gustave Eiffel. 7 years before he built the tower in Paris that would permanently attach his name to the city, Eiffel was already famous across Europe for his iron bridges and viaducts, structures that solved engineering problems others had declared unsolvable. What he brought to the Statue of Liberty project was a structural concept of genuine originality. Rather than trying to make the statue rigid, which would have caused the copper to crack under the stress of harbor winds and temperature changes, Eiffel designed it to move. The morning of October 28th arrived cold and grey, and wrapped in harbor fog so thick that from the Manhattan shore you could barely see the island. It was, in terms of weather, almost precisely the worst possible day for an outdoor ceremony, centered on a statue that most of the attending crowd would be trying to view from a distance across open water. The fog sat over the harbor and showed no interest in moving. It didn't matter. Over 1 million people lined the Battery and packed every available foot of Manhattan's waterfront. Hundreds of boats filled the harbor. Naval vessels, ferries, private craft, everything that could float and had found a reason to be in the water that morning. The parade down Broadway had drawn crowds so thick that they spilled off the sidewalks and into the street. And at some point during that parade, in a moment that nobody planned and nobody could have predicted, workers in the office buildings along Broadway began throwing things out of their windows. Paper, ticker tape from the telegraph machines, torn strips of whatever was on their desks, streamers of adding machine paper spiraling down into the street below. It was an accident. Nobody organized it. Nobody gave the signal. It started because people in offices were watching a parade they couldn't fully participate in from 7 stories up, and they ran out of ways to express what they were feeling and started throwing whatever was at hand out the windows. And in doing so, they invented the New York City Ticker Tape Parade, a tradition that would mark every subsequent major civic triumph in the city's history, from returning war heroes to championship sports teams to astronauts. Born accidentally on a foggy October morning because ordinary people in office buildings couldn't contain what they were feeling. Bartholdi was positioned high inside the statue, near the top, holding a rope connected to the French tricolor flag draped over Liberty's face. The plan was that a signal would come from below when President Cleveland finished his speech, and Bartholdi would pull the rope and the flag would fall, and the face of the statue would be revealed to the harbor for the first time. What actually happened was that someone in the crowd, impatient or overcome or simply unable to help himself, gave the signal early. Bartholdi pulled the rope. The flag fell. The harbour erupted. Boat whistles, cannon fire, cheering that carried across the water in waves through the fog. President Grover Cleveland had not finished his speech. He finished it anyway, to an audience that was no longer listening, because the statue was there, above the mist, the torch just visible, and that was more significant than anything a president could say about it. Bartholdi stood at the base afterward, in what most accounts describe as silence. He had been working on this since he was 21 years old. He had crossed the Atlantic multiple times. He had watched money run out, and an architect die, and his completed statue sit in crates on a dock for the better part of a year. And now she was standing in the harbour, exactly where he had seen her standing in his mind the first time he sailed into New York in 1871. And she was larger than the skyline. And the crowd was still cheering somewhere out in the fog. And there was nothing left to do but stand there and let it be finished. She oxidized slowly over the years that followed. The copper turned from its original warm brown through progressively darker shades, then gradually into the blue-green verdigris that the salt air of the harbour produces in copper over time. By the early 20th century, she was the colour we know her as today, that particular shade of weathered copper that has become so associated with the statue, it's difficult to imagine her any other way. But for the first years of her existence, she was brown, warm, almost golden in certain harbour light. A different visual presence than the one we know, but the same woman. She has survived 2 world wars. A massive munitions explosion at a nearby depot during World War I sent shrapnel across the harbour and cracked plaster in lower Manhattan buildings. The damage to the torch arm was significant enough that it has been closed to visitors ever since. She survived decades of maintenance neglect that allowed water to seep through her copper skin and begin corroding Eiffel's iron framework from the inside. A major restoration in the 1980s replaced much of that original ironwork with stainless steel, essentially performing the structural equivalent of a transplant while keeping everything on the outside exactly as it was. Emma Lazarus wrote The New Colossus, the poem mounted at her base, the one with the lines about huddled masses yearning to breathe free, in 1883, 3 years before the statue was dedicated. She wrote it originally to help raise money for the Pedestal Fund as a contribution to the auction that Pulitzer's campaign had organized. The poem was not mounted inside the pedestal until 1903, 17 years after the dedication ceremony. Lazarus herself died of cancer in 1887, at 38 years old, 1 year after the dedication, never knowing that the lines she had written for a fundraising auction would become the most famous words ever attached to the most famous statue in the world. That specific detail, the most recognized literary expression of what America is supposed to stand for, written by a woman who never saw the finished work, attached to the monument 17 years after the fact, belongs to the whole strange, improbable, profoundly human story of how this thing got built. Nothing about it was clean. Nothing was on schedule. Nothing arrived in the order it was supposed to. The engineer who was supposed to design the skeleton died. The pedestal money ran out twice. The completed statue sat in crates for nearly a year. The poem that defines her meaning was added as an afterthought by a committee after the poet was already gone. And yet, she is standing in the harbour right now. She was standing there this morning when the first ferry of the day went out. She will be standing there tonight when the last boat comes back. She will be standing there, all reasonable things being equal, long after everyone alive today has stopped being alive. That is what it looks like when people refuse to let an idea die because the logistics are difficult. When they keep building past the point where stopping would have been reasonable, past the dead architects and the empty bank accounts and the crates sitting on a dock in the rain. Bartholdi refused. Eiffel refused. Laboulaye refused. Pulitzer refused. And 120,000 people who sent dollar bills and pennies to a New York newspaper because they believed something was worth building. They refused. The result of that collective refusal is standing in New York Harbor, facing the Atlantic, holding a torch that has been raised above the water for 138 years. 4 million people a year tilt their heads back and feel something they don't quite have words for. And now you know what they are actually looking at. Thank you for being here for this. If this story landed for you, please hit like and subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people. And if there is a monument, a city, an era of history you want us to explore together, drop it in the comments. I read every single one. See you next time.